Britain's debt now stands at 100% of GDP. This poses a huge challenge for its first female chancellor, Rachel Reeves, ahead of the autumn budget. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, rising borrowing costs, a massive debt mountain and slow growth portray a bleak picture of Britain's economy. Getting it growing again is the #1 priority for Chancellor Rachel Reeves. So, can she sort out the UK's faltering finances?
She is Britain's first female chancellor. Rachel Reeves took on the role after the Labour Party won a landslide victory in the UK elections this year. With it, though, she inherited government finances, which Reeves described as the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. As a UK budget looms, tough decisions have to be made.
Yes, we must deal with the Tory legacy, and that means tough decisions. But I won't let that dim our ambition for Britain. So it will be a budget with real ambition, a budget to fix the foundations, a budget to deliver the change that we promised, a budget to rebuild Britain.
So how bad are the numbers? In September, UK debt had grown to 100% of the country's economic output, figures not seen since the 1960s. This means Britain now owes as much as it produces in a year. Total borrowing has reached £64.1 billion so far this year, which is £6 billion higher than expected. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has already warned the October 30 budget will be painful, with expected tax hikes, spending cuts, and a crackdown on the wealthiest.
We have no other choice, given the situation that we're in. Those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heavier burden. And that's why we're cracking down on non-doms. Those who made the mess should have to do their bit to clean it up.
But so far, it's Labour's plan to cut winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners, which has dominated headlines, angering the public and causing divisions within the Labour Party.
Friends, people simply do not understand. I do not understand how our new Labour government can cut the winter fuel allowance for pensioners and leave the super rich untouched. This is not what people voted for. It's the wrong decision and it needs to be reversed.
It all comes as Britain is grappling with a cost of living crisis, inflation and high interest rates, although there has been some good news for Labour. The UK economy has been given a major upgrade from the OECD, forecasting its GDP to rise 1.1% and describing its growth as robust. So as the budget deadline looms, how will the UK government fix its debt crisis, and what pressure is Rachel Reeves facing as she prepares to deliver her first budget?
Well, let's meet our guests. Here in the studio, I'm joined by Scarlett MccGwire. She's a former Labour Party advisor. In London, Allie Renison. She's Associate Director at SEC Newgate. That's a UK public relations firm, and a former policy advisor to the Business and Trade Secretary of State. In Liverpool, in England, Jonathan Tonge. He is Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool. I'll come to you first, Scarlett. I mean, let's be frank, this Labour government has inherited a hospital pass of a country, hasn't it?
I mean, it's absolutely terrible. When they talk about the 22 billion black hole, they are not kidding. So, I mean, one of the things is the Tories made a lot of promises. None of them were funded. So you look at that and you think, well, where were they going to get the money from? And worse than that is they didn't put any money aside for the public sector pay things. Now, how much was still being negotiated, or not, as one could say, because there were no meetings. But everybody knew they were going to have to pay something, but that money wasn't put aside. So that's what's so dreadful, is it wasn't just, we knew there was a problem. I mean, we knew that the books weren't going to be great, but to suddenly find that there were these gaps, Rachel Reeves had to do something.
Ali, The British public will now be swallowing a lot of medicine off the back of what the Conservatives have left behind. How can Rachel Reeves fix Britain?
Well, if you take what Labour is saying they're going to do, a lot of this is about supposedly kind of, painful decisions for long-term sustainability. I think that one of the interesting things to watch is whether this budget is really going to sort of, some people would argue that some of the areas being looked at are tackling tax avoidance, for example, areas and loopholes in inheritance tax, looking at sort of basically trying to close down relief for some of the better off earners amongst the pensioners. But I'm not sure how much of a massive revenue raiser it's going to end up being. Now, interestingly, that Labour have said that they're going to also, alongside the budget, there's a spending review ongoing for government departments, but there's also going to be a roadmap for business taxation. And I think I would anticipate that some of the areas that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is probably looking at to try and close off some of these tax reliefs for businesses may not be in the budget, but basically will be dangled in this roadmap.
John, to you, weather hasn't been great in the UK lately. A lot of wind, a lot of rain. Keir Starmer picked up on that in his speech, and he said Britain needs to turn up its collar and effectively face the elements. So make no mistake, tax rises are coming.
Oh, tax rises are coming for sure in the budget on October the 30th. The question is where, though, because remember that Labour, when in opposition, pledged during the election campaign that they would not increase income tax, they would not increase VAT, they would not increase national insurance. So the scope for tax rise is more limited in terms of areas. We'll probably see a raid on pensions and some tax-free lump sums. Hitherto, tax-free lump sums might be hit. We'll almost certainly see an increase in capital gains tax. We'll probably see something on inheritance tax. But the simple fact is, the government, whichever government, is always spending more than it earns. If you look since 1970, there's only been 5 times when there's been a surplus at the Treasury. Okay? In every other year, there's been more spent than has been earned by the UK Exchequer. You can't carry on like that. And even in the so-called years of austerity under David Cameron's Conservative government, we're still spending more than we earned. The fact is that Labour now says that they're going to get tough in a way the Conservatives used to say, we'll get tough on public spending. There was certainly in Liverpool this week absolutely no promise of jam even tomorrow from Keir Starmer. It was jam perhaps a couple of years down the line at best.
Scarlett, just on that point, there's zero appetite amongst the British public for tax rises. COVID, inflation, cost of living crisis, energy rises going into winter again. I mean, the public won't stomach this level of taxation, will they?
No, and he was completely right when he said that the 3 main taxes Keir Starmer's promised not to put up, Keir and Rachel, and that leaves you with lots of little things that aren't going to earn you very much. And there is a problem here about... is we don't like just bad news. We want good news. So there's one problem that we want a healthy public sector. It's always been a joke that the British people have wanted sort of Nordic public services with American taxes, and you just don't get it. But actually, what Labour's going to have to do, and Rachel did talk a bit about tweaking, but it's going to have to be about investing. I mean, we've got to see a turnaround in the economy, and it's what she invests in.
Ali, just on that point, is Britain still a good place for investment? I mean, will foreign companies want to come to London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Leeds?
I mean, I think, while the fundamentals are always there, there are areas where it will, to some extent, we've talked a lot about in the UK, even under a Conservative government, about making it a place to invest for the green transition. If you look at some of the countries where there is actually a genuine lot of investment, there are really big policy statements that are made that actually facilitate that. In the Netherlands, for example, they've sort of banned gas boil makers, and that has actually helped attract a lot of investment. I don't know to what extent even Ed Miliband, who is definitely behind behind the sort of move towards decarbonisation and move towards electricity is willing to go that far. So I think that, from a green investment point of view, we have the National Wealth Fund that Labour have promised. I mean, a lot of this is about trying to help direct investment rather than put huge amounts in. There was the 28 billion pledge before the election that was watered down, supposedly on account, as Labour said, of kind of the consequences of Liz Truss's mini budget. But I think they're going to be looking at the private sector to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And the last thing I would say on that is that, there's a big first mission of Labour supposedly is on growth. Yes, they're going to be looking at closing off some of the tax reliefs for pensioners, but at the same time, they're also hoping to try and use basically a pensions review to actually stimulate tapping up sort of different pools of capital to try and facilitate this investment into the green transition. And I don't know if we'll end up seeing a bit of a cognitive dissonance there.
John, who do you think is going to be hit the hardest then when the budget comes?
That's very difficult to say. I mean, I think the emphasis will be on putting more people into work. I think pensioners will probably be hit. I mean, you've got to remember, pensioners have already been hit by the removal of the winter fuel allowance. That was not mentioned at all in Labour's election-winning manifesto. And you can argue that in an election fought partly on trust, that was a sleight of hand by the Labour Party. So pensions would certainly be one. Certainly those who, anything in terms of unearned income, and there'll be the usual, often bluster, frankly, about closing tax loopholes. If it was that easy, we'd have closed those tax loopholes long ago. I mean, the problem is that we're spending too much and we're not raising enough. That's the simple equation. If you look at some of the biggest spending aspects of government, what have you got? You've got £360 billion per year spent on social security. If you try and cut that budget, you hurt some of the poorest off people in the land. So how do you cut a social security budget? Then you've got education. More than 100 billion is spent on that. Well, who's going to cut back on expenditure on the nation's school children? So there's just two examples. I mean, you could quote the others. Obviously, at the NHS always devours more money. There's more money, whether it be a Conservative government or a Labour government. They've spent more in real terms, that is beyond inflation. Consecutive governments have done that. And yet people are complaining about the state of the NHS. So there are no magic solutions to this at all. It's not just about spending money. And it is, as Ali pointed out, it's also about improving growth so that you can begin to at least attack that level of debt. Worth remembering, last year alone, we paid more than £100 billion in debt interest. That was nearly the size of the Department of Education's own budget. We can't go on like that.
That's staggering, isn't it, Scarlett? £100 billion in interest payments alone.
It's absolutely staggering. And actually, one of the reasons is that the independent Bank of England put up interest rates, which didn't help anything at all. And there is a whole question about the fact that it's no longer in political control means that you can't control a really important thing. But I think when we're talking about investment, I mean, what we forget is the investment in people, right? Is that John's absolutely right. We can't take it away from schools because actually, I mean, in sheer economic terms, we've got to have people coming out with skills, right? And, the thing about the NHS is that we've got lots of people on long-term sick who can't work. And actually, there's a whole campaign called We Are the Economy. It's about investing in people and saying that to say you can't invest in public services because it's too expensive is actually the wrong way round.
Ali, there's one group of people I want to take a look at, and just give me your opinion on this. 9 million inactive British adults, economically inactive. There are 9 million people in the UK, aged 16 to 65, who are not in employment, not working, not paying tax, not contributing anything, but at the same time they will be using the NHS, they will be driving on the roads. How big a problem is that for the British government?
I think it also depends on to what extent what you're actually doing about it. So it's not as if previous governments haven't tried to tackle this. We moved all of our kind of social welfare, our benefits and programs into one area to try and make it more streamlined. Universal credit. We had means testing, and I know that interestingly, one of the things that unites the sort of means testing argument, whether it's talking about the winter fuel allowance or on kind of social benefits, is actually this sort of principle for Labour that is kind of it goes against, which is universality. But ultimately, I think there has to be a discussion about are we trying to balance universality off against actually getting a collective of more people into work? And I think one of the things that I've noticed and was being discussed at sort of different skills events at Labour conference was there's a huge focus on the young. Huge focus on the young, but not only I think are Labour looking at it now, but obviously the previous Chancellor Jeremy Hunt had a big thing about getting older people back into work. You know, there's a lot of focus on apprenticeships, people who have skills who, for no fault of their own, may lose their jobs, and there's not a lot of help and support for them to get into either retraining or to get them back into the workplace. And I think that we need to focus as much on the sort of the NEETs, as you call them, who are older, as much as the sort of the younger people as they start out in life.
John, do you agree with that this is an area where progress can be made?
We've got to get more people into work because there are so many people who are not in work for various reasons. It is diminishing the tax base. We need a bigger tax base. But again, that's easier said than done. In a previous life, I worked for the Department of Employment, and episodically, we'd have crackdowns on so-called and quote unquote welfare scroungers, those who were, for example, fraudulently claiming unemployment benefit, topping up their income. But a lot of the time, it was about shifting people onto different benefits. So we'd shift them from unemployment benefit to sickness benefit. It didn't actually solve the problem that these people were not actually working and they weren't contributing to the exchequer. Now, both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have been very clear that the number of workless in Britain is too high. But what can you do about that? Yes, you can shift them around on benefits. You struggle, as Allie's just indicated, you struggle to get people, those who've quit the workforce in their late 50s, early 60s, they may have many skills to offer, but how do you entice them back into work when they think, well, I've done my time? But certainly we do need a higher level of employment in Britain if we're going to start attacking that 100% of GDP debt that we currently have. If you look at it, if you look at the last, I'm drowning figures here, but for every £39,000 that a household contributes to the exchequer, £42,000 is spent. So that's £3,000. It may not sound much per household, but it's an awful lot if you add it across all the households across the UK.
Scarlett, I want to take a look at the super rich. I read a report this week. A company called Henley & Partners made a prediction 9,500 millionaires will have left the UK by the end of this year, many of them heading to Dubai and the United Arab Emirates for tax reasons. How big an issue is this? I mean...
Well, I think we really don't know whether it's true. Because, I've heard this all my life, and it certainly happened under the Blair government that everybody said. And actually, the problem with Dubai, if you live in London, is you lose the culture, you lose all of that. I mean, actually, people like living in London, and a lot of people are prepared to pay higher tax. So we do need to really look at what happens. It's a bit like the VAT on private schools, where they say all these children are going to be pulled out, it's going to be a disaster, and it won't happen.
Yeah.
It's just the flight. Of course, there will be some multimillionaires leaving, and I've spoken to lawyers who deal with them who say yes, but actually they reckon it's a much lower figure.
Allie, just on that point, are you worried about that number of millionaires supposedly leaving Britain because of higher taxation?
I think I'd be less worried about the overall number of individuals and more worried about, what is their contribution to, in terms of sort of, there can be some really big taxpayers who could make a dent. It's less about sort of overall number. I thought it was interesting that actually the report where there was this first trail came from The Guardian, not exactly from, a right-wing sort of conservative newspaper. And the reports was that it was basically the estimates that Treasury officials are fearing the estimates due to be released by the OBR, not by sort of, someone out of thin air, may suggest that the policy will actually, of closing off the non-dom sort of tax loophole, will fail to raise any money because of the impact of the amount of them leaving. So I think it remains to be seen. But I think, it's a bit like investment, though, as Scarlett was saying. You asked me earlier about what will be the impact on investment. Is this sort of climate that's set to continue? Well, ultimately, the fundamentals are here, and I think that will probably mitigate the impact from being too significant.
John, every single leader who comes in, every single chancellor, the word growth is probably in their very first sentence when they get the job. How does Rachel Reeves now create growth in the UK?
Well, it's partly by investment, and it is very difficult to invest given the lack of money for investment. But, Labour has indicated some plans. Obviously, Great British Energy is a form of investment, and it's many ways it's a smart form of investment. It's quite prudent what the government is trying to do in that respect. So whereas other infrastructure projects that there was going to be investment in, like HS2, were cancelled to some extent under the previous government, I think Labour is committed to investment in certain key areas of the economy. That will certainly help. It will help to some degree. It will also create jobs, more jobs, and that will again increase the net take for the Treasury. So I think, in that sense, yes, it is true that all chancellors talk about growth. They have to, because growth is the only way that we're going to be able to pay back the debt and indeed the annual deficit, which is rising year by year. I mean, again, more than 13 billion was the deficit for August alone this year. We spent 13 billion more than we actually earned. So we have to have growth. I don't think it'll be easy for Rachel Reeves, and I don't think Rachel Reeves believes it's easy. I think what you're seeing, though, is probably the most cautious Labour government in lots of ways that has ever come in. I mean, Harold Wilson back in the day talked about a good, a great deal of investment. Jim Callaghan was the first Labour leader to say you simply can't spend. But the contrast, I think, what was really, really interesting, I thought, at the Labour conference this week in Liverpool was, Tony Blair came to power. Well, the last time Labour came to power in the UK, he was talking about massive investment in education, the big slogan, all this money that was going to be invested via windfall taxes on the public utilities. There was none of that in Liverpool this week. There was nowhere near the investment programme that we saw from Labour from 1997 to 2001 because of the more straitened financial circumstances, partly, of course, caused by the growth, the lack of growth during the pandemic, which set not just the UK back, of course, but other European nations. If you actually look at the UK's rate of growth, it is comparable with other European countries.
Just on that point, Scarlett, I mean, Germany flatlining along, France has huge problems, massive public debt as well. I mean, the UK is not alone here.
The UK is not alone. But when John says about COVID, of course, he's completely right. But actually, what we all now know is the austerity brought in by Cameron and Osborne was a disaster for Britain. And I think it's a real lesson that, frankly, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer need to learn, is that Rachel and Keir have both said there will be no austerity. And they're going to... I mean, I don't know what the risk will be. But actually, austerity is very, very bad for the country. I think we've heard that the reason the hospitals couldn't cope with COVID is because there weren't enough.
Austerity.
Yeah, it was austerity. I mean, the schools were already on their knees. Austerity. So actually, that is why we need to invest in people and invest in public services to give us resilience and then make us more attractive.
Ali, just give us your take on the whole Brexit conundrum. I mean, everyone talks about growth and Britain's place in the world. The Brexit calamity has not been addressed.
No, I mean, it's interesting, actually, that news broke today that Keir Starmer will be meeting for the first time with the repeat European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, next week, resetting of relations. But if you talk to economists, ultimately, a lot of what Labour are looking to do in terms of its reset with the EU post-Brexit is, in terms of neighbourly relations, great, but it's not going to make a big bang economically. Nothing outside of going back into the single market and potentially a customs union of some kind is going to do that. But I think that ship has really sailed here politically in the UK. I don't think Labour are willing to do it. So ultimately, it might make things a bit easier, but it's not going to have a transformative effect on the economy in the way that if we had stayed in the EU, all bells and whistles might have.
John, just give us your impression of Rachel Reeves then. It's the second biggest job in the country. She's the first ever female chancellor. I mean, she needs to get this budget right for everyone.
Well, I think Rachel Reeves has restored Labour's credibility in terms of how to manage the economy. Labour is popular again with businesses. You could barely move round the conference at Liverpool, given the amount of businesses that were exhibiting there. So Labour is seen as a party of economic competence again. It's seen as a party that can be trusted by business. That's the good news so far. But obviously, she's going to be measured in terms of delivery. Can she achieve growth? Can she stop or not implement punitive tax rises on October the 30th? Because tax rises aren't going to help. They're a drag upon growth. I mean, Labour's not going to introduce punitive wealth taxes. This is not like, old Labour where you simply try and tax the rich. It isn't about that. But there could be a number of stealth taxes introduced in late October, which will have people trying to move money, particularly the better off, people trying to move money, hide money away in many ways. And therefore, the idea you could simply raise taxes, just pull it as a lever, and that will generate more growth, which you can use or generate more money to invest in. If it was only that easy, previous chancellors would have tried it. It simply isn't that easy at all.
Scarlett, how do you think the Conservatives will be feeling when this budget comes out? Because ultimately, they created this mess. Rachel Reeves' popularity will be taking the hit because she's sorting out their mess.
Absolutely, and it won't bother them at all. I mean, they'll be fine about it. It's like they're attacking her on the winter fuel levy, even though we all know, I don't think it has been done very well, but we all know that actually...
It had to be done.
Well, there are about 7.5 million pensioners who should not be getting an extra £300 a year.
These are wealthy people.
Unfortunately, she's hit the people who aren't, and that's a problem. But there is no question that the Tories will be pretending that, of course, they would have brought in a budget that was wonderful.
Scarlett, thank you. And to Ali and John as well, thank you so much for your contribution to this Roundtable. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.